What happens when the person you underestimate turns out to be the most powerful one in the room? A wealthy black man walks into a bank to make a simple transaction, only to be met with doubt, humiliation, and blatant discrimination. The arrogant bank manager assumes he doesn't belong, treating him like a fraud. But with one swipe of a card, everything changes. In a matter of minutes, the balance of power shifts, careers are ruined, and an unexpected lesson is taught, one that the bank manager will never forget. What happened inside that bank? And why did the man he disrespected offer him a second chance? Stay tuned, because this story is one you don't want to miss. Before we continue, make sure to like the video and subscribe the channel so the community can grow, and we can bring you more stories like this. Now, let's get into it. It was a crisp Monday morning in Oak Ridge City, and Sterling National Bank was already buzzing with activity. Employees in pressed suits hurried behind the counters, answering phones and assisting customers. The scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, blending with the faint hum of office chatter. At the center of it all sat Richard Calloway, the bank's manager, a middle-aged man with salt-and-pepper hair, an expensive wristwatch, and a condescending smirk that rarely left his face. He prided himself on running a high-class establishment, one that, in his mind, only catered to a certain kind of clientele. So when a tall, well-dressed black man walked through the double-glass doors, Richard's expression twisted slightly. He watched as the man strode across the marble floors, his Italian leather shoes clicking with confidence. He wore a tailored navy blue suit, a Rolex peeking from under his cuff, and dark sunglasses that he removed with a slow, deliberate motion. The man approached the reception desk and Richard leaned forward, already assuming he knew how this would play out. "Good morning," the man said in a smooth, assured voice. "I'd like to make a transaction." The young teller at the counter smiled warmly. "Of course, sir. How can I assist you?" Before the man could respond, Richard stood up and walked over. He didn't like the way this man carried himself. Too self-assured, too at ease, as if he belonged. "I can take it from here, Claire," Richard said, dismissing the teller with a forced smile. Then he turned his attention to the man. "Is there something I can help you with?" His tone was polite, but there was an unmistakable edge of condescension in his voice. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly noticing the shift in tone. "Yes," he said, unfazed. "I need to make a withdrawal from my account. A rather large one." Richard folded his arms. "Oh? And how large are we talking?" "A little over $500,000. Silence fell over the nearby employees. A few tellers discreetly glanced in their direction, their curiosity piqued. Richard, however, let out a low chuckle, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I see," he said slowly. "And you have an account here?" The man's jaw tightened slightly. "I do." Richard exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if he had just been presented with an absurd request. "Look, sir," he said, his voice dripping with skepticism, "we don't just hand out that kind of money to anyone. We have security measures in place." The man studied Richard for a long moment. "I understand security measures," he said, "but I have more than enough in my account. I can provide identification." Richard smirked, tapping his fingers against the counter. "I'm sure you can, but humor me. How exactly did you come across that kind of money?" A tense silence followed. The question hung in the air like a heavy fog, thick with implication. The man's eyes darkened, but his voice remained steady. "Are you asking me that because you're genuinely curious," he said, "or because you don't believe someone like me could have it?" Richard's smirk faltered for just a second, but he quickly recovered. "Now, let's not make this about what?" The man took a small step forward, his presence commanding. "I walked in here as a customer, but you," he gestured toward Richard, "are treating me like a suspect." Richard cleared his throat, suddenly aware of the attention they were drawing. "I'm just following protocol," he said hastily. The man nodded, as if filing that response away for later. Then, without another word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black card. He slid it across the counter. "Run it," he said. Richard hesitated. His instincts told him not to find a reason, any reason, to deny this man service. But there was something about the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, that made Richard uneasy. Finally, he exhaled sharply and snatched the card off the counter. "Fine," he said, walking toward the computer. "Let's see what we're dealing with." But Richard had no idea that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. Richard slid the sleek black card into the reader, his fingers tapping impatiently as he waited for the system to respond. He still wasn't convinced. $500,000. From this guy? It didn't add up. In his mind, men like him, well-dressed or not, weren't the type to have that kind of wealth. The computer beeped, and Richard's smirk returned. He hummed, squinting at the screen. "Well, that's strange." The black man, who had remained calm up until now, tilted his head slightly. "What's strange?" Richard tapped a few keys, then shook his head in faux sympathy. "It says here that there's an issue with your account." A few tellers exchanged uneasy glances. Claire, the young teller Richard had dismissed earlier, subtly shifted in her seat. She had worked at the bank long enough to recognize what was happening. The man's expression remained unreadable. What kind of issue? Richard leaned on the counter, lacing his fingers together. "Well, it appears your account is flagged for suspicious activity." A few gasps rippled through the bank. One customer in the queue frowned, while another looked at the black man with mild curiosity. The man's jaw tightened. "That's impossible," he said, his voice even. Richard shrugged. "I don't know what to tell you." His smirk widened. "Maybe it's a glitch. Maybe it's something else. Either way, I can't authorize your withdrawal." The man's eyes locked onto Richard's with a quiet intensity. "Run it again," he said. Richard chuckled. "Sir, I don't think—" "I said run it again." The authority in his voice sent a ripple of tension through the room. A few employees held their breath. Richard hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, but he didn't want to back down, not in front of everyone. With an exaggerated sigh, he slid the card through once more. A second beep, and then Richard's smirk vanished. His face paled as he stared at the screen. The color drained from his cheeks and his Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. Available balance: $57,864,903.45. The air shifted. The tellers, the customers, the security guard by the door, everyone felt it. The black man hadn't just been telling the truth. He was filthy rich. Richard's hands suddenly felt clammy. He blinked rapidly, as if hoping the numbers on the screen would change. They didn't. Slowly, the man leaned in, resting his palms on the counter. His voice, low and measured, carried an unmistakable weight. "Would you like to tell me again," he asked, "why my account is flagged for suspicious activity?" Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The man tilted his head. "Or would you like to explain why you assumed I couldn't have this kind of money?" Silence. Utter. Deadly. Silence. The tension in the bank was thick enough to cut. Richard's lips parted, his brain scrambling for an excuse. A way out. But there was none. The damage was done. And it was about to get worse. Much worse. Richard's fingers trembled slightly as he cleared his throat. His mind raced for an explanation, an excuse, anything that would save him from the mess he had just walked into. He stammered, but the words stuck to his tongue like glue. The black man simply stared at him, his eyes steady and unreadable. He wasn't yelling, wasn't causing a scene, but the power in his silence was deafening. A few customers shifted uncomfortably. One elderly woman in line narrowed her eyes at Richard as if seeing him for what he truly was. Claire, the young teller, folded her arms. She had seen Richard treat certain customers with a little too much skepticism before, but this was a new level of blatant discrimination. The man exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a business card. Without breaking eye contact, he slid it across the counter. Richard hesitated before picking it up, his eyes scanning the text. Jonathan Kingston, CEO, Kingston Global Investments. Richard's stomach plummeted. He knew that name. Jonathan Kingston wasn't just a wealthy man, he was a powerhouse. His firm managed billions in assets, real estate, and venture capital. He had been featured in countless financial magazines, spoken at international summits, and had his name whispered in high-powered business circles. And Richard had just disrespected him. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. "I don't think I need to tell you what I could do with one phone call," he said, his voice calm, but layered with an undeniable warning. Richard swallowed. "Mr. Kingston, I came here to make a simple transaction. That's it," Jonathan said, his fingers drumming against the counter. "But instead of treating me like any other customer, you made assumptions. You treated me like a criminal." Richard's mouth opened and closed. His face burned with humiliation, and for the first time in his career, he had no control. "Sir," he tried, I didn't mean any offense. It was just protocol." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Protocol," he echoed. "Tell me, Mr. Calloway, would you have run a similar security check if a man who looked like you walked in asking for a withdrawal?" Richard had no answer, because they both knew the truth. A long, uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Jonathan exhaled, shaking his head. "You know," he said, "I believe in giving people opportunities. That's how I built my empire, by investing in others." He looked Richard over. "But I don't invest in people who can't see past their own ignorance." Richard's heart hammered. "I think we're done here," Jonathan said, taking back his black card. He turned to Claire, who had been watching the exchange with growing unease. "You," he said, offering a slight smile, "you seem competent. Would you be able to process my transaction?" Claire's eyes flickered to Richard. He looked like he was about to be sick. With newfound confidence, she stepped forward. "Of course, sir." Richard felt the room closing in on him. He wanted to stop her, wanted to salvage his authority, but he knew his fate was sealed. And Jonathan Kingston wasn't done teaching him a lesson. Not by a long shot. Richard stood frozen, his mind scrambling for a way to fix this. But it was too late. Claire had already stepped in, her hands steady as she began processing Jonathan Kingston's withdrawal. The beep of the computer felt like a death knell to Richard. "Everything looks good on our end, Mr. Kingston," Claire said, casting him a reassuring smile. "How would you like the withdrawal? Cashier's check or direct transfer?" "Transfer," Jonathan replied smoothly. "But I'd like a printed receipt." Claire nodded. "Of course." Richard could barely hear the conversation over the pounding in his ears. He wanted to stop this, wanted to stop him. But what could he say? That he had lied about the account being flagged? That he had tried to humiliate a man who could buy this bank 3 times over? Jonathan tapped his fingers against the counter, looking at Richard with an expression of calm amusement. "You know," he said, "I once considered opening a corporate account with Sterling National. I like to spread my business around." Richard perked up slightly. An opening, a chance to redeem himself. "But after today," Jonathan chuckled, shaking his head, "I think I'll take my investments elsewhere." Richard's stomach dropped. "Wait, sir." He started, but Jonathan held up a hand. "No," he said firmly. "You've done enough." Claire handed Jonathan his receipt. "All set, Mr. Kingston." Jonathan took the paper and slid it into his pocket. Then, very deliberately, he turned to the other customers in the bank, people who had been watching everything unfold with silent curiosity. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying through the room, "I'd like to thank you all for your patience today. But before I go, I have one last piece of business to handle." Richard's fingers clenched at his sides. He had a very bad feeling about this. Jonathan looked toward the glass office at the back of the bank, where a plaque read, "Branch Director, Charles Bellamy." "Mr. Bellamy," Jonathan called out, his voice laced with authority. A man in his 60s, dressed in a charcoal gray suit, stood from his desk immediately. He had been watching everything unfold from behind his office door, his face unreadable. But now, as Jonathan addressed him, he strode forward, his expression shifting into something apologetic. "Yes, Mr. Kingston," Bellamy said carefully. Jonathan slipped his sunglasses back on. "I'd like to file a formal complaint about Mr. Calloway here," he said, tilting his head toward Richard. "You might want to have a conversation about how he treats your customers." Bellamy's gaze flickered to Richard. Richard knew that look. It was the look of someone calculating a problem and already deciding to get rid of it. Jonathan adjusted his cufflinks. "Oh, and one more thing," he added. Bellamy straightened. "Yes?" Jonathan smiled. "I own a few commercial buildings in the city," he said casually. "One of them happens to house Sterling National's main competitor." Richard's breath hitched. Bellamy's eyes widened slightly. Jonathan slipped his hands into his pockets. "After today's experience, I think I'll offer them a lower lease rate to help them expand." He shrugged. "Maybe even build a new headquarters." Richard felt the floor disappear beneath him. Bellamy's expression hardened. "Mr. Kingston, I assure you that Sterling National takes these matters very seriously. We will be reviewing Mr. Calloway's behavior immediately." Jonathan nodded once, satisfied. "Glad to hear it." Then, without another glance at Richard, he turned and walked toward the exit. As he stepped through the double glass doors and into the morning sun, Richard's world crumbled around him. Because he knew. His career was over. And it had all happened in less than 15 minutes. The glass doors swung shut behind Jonathan Kingston, but the storm he had left inside the bank was just beginning. Richard Calloway stood stiffly behind the counter, his face drained of color. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room, customers whispering, employees exchanging looks. The power he had once held, the authority he had wielded with arrogance, was now slipping from his fingers like sand. "Mr. Calloway." The voice was firm, unforgiving. Richard turned slowly. Charles Bellamy, the branch director, stood before him, arms crossed over his chest. His gray eyes were sharp, his lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. "In my office," Bellamy said, voice like a hammer striking steel. Richard swallowed hard. His feet felt like lead as he followed Bellamy through the bank. The short walk felt like a death march. Employees quickly turned away, pretending to focus on their work, but Richard could feel their judgment, their silent satisfaction. They had seen him humiliate customers before, but today, karma had arrived in a tailored suit. Bellamy stepped into his office and held the door open. "Sit," he ordered. Richard did as he was told, his hands clammy, his thoughts racing. He could fix this. He had to fix this. Bellamy closed the door and lowered himself into his chair, his gaze locked onto Richard like a predator sizing up wounded prey. "What?" Bellamy asked, his voice dangerously even. "Were you thinking?" Richard opened his mouth, his mind scrambling for an excuse. "Sir, Don't," Bellamy snapped. "Don't insult my intelligence by pretending you don't know what you did." He leaned forward. "You took one look at that man, a highly respected, incredibly wealthy man, and assumed he was a fraud." Richard's throat was dry. I was following protocol." Bellamy's eyes darkened. "Don't lie to me." Richard flinched. "I've watched you, Calloway," Bellamy continued, his voice low but razor-sharp. "You think I haven't noticed how you treat certain customers differently? How you scrutinize some more than others? He shook his head in disgust. But today, you didn't just discriminate against any random person. You disrespected the wrong man. Richard's pulse pounded in his ears. I just made a call to corporate, Bellamy said, leaning back in his chair. They're furious. Kingston Global Investments was considering bringing us millions in new business. And now, his lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. Now, they're planning to partner with our biggest rival. Do you know what that means? Richard didn't respond. He already knew. It meant millions in lost revenue. It meant Sterling National's reputation was tarnished. And it meant his job was hanging by a thread. Bellamy exhaled slowly. Head office will decide your fate by tomorrow morning, he said. But if I were you... He gave Richard a cold, thin-lipped smile. I'd start packing my things. Richard felt his world shatter. Everything he had built, the career he had prided himself on, the power he had held over others, all of it, gone. And it was all because he had underestimated the wrong man. Richard sat in Charles Bellamy's office, his mind spinning. His career, his entire reputation was unraveling right in front of him. This couldn't be happening. Not to him. He cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of control. Sir, I've been with this bank for years. Bellamy cut him off with a sharp look. And in those years, how many other potential investors have you driven away with this kind of behavior? Richard clenched his fists. That's not fair. This was an isolated incident. Bellamy scoffed. No, Calloway, it wasn't. He leaned back in his chair. I've had complaints about you before, subtle ones. Customers feeling unwelcome. Clients questioning your attitude. But today, he shook his head. Today, there's no brushing it under the rug. You humiliated one of the most powerful men in this city. Richard felt hot all over. He wanted to argue, to defend himself. But what could he say? He had assumed Jonathan Kingston was a fraud, despite every sign pointing to the contrary. He had let his bias cloud his judgment. And now, he was paying the price. Bellamy exhaled. You know, Kingston could have reacted much worse, he said, if he had chosen to sue for discrimination. If he had decided to take this to the media. He shook his head again. You wouldn't just be losing your job, Calloway. You'd be ruining your career. The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. A job loss was one thing, but career suicide? No bank, no financial institution would touch him if this story got out. Bellamy stood, signaling that their conversation was over. I don't want to see you at that counter again today, he said. Go home. Wait for corporate's decision. Richard hesitated. Sir. Now. Bellamy's tone left no room for argument. Defeated, Richard rose from the chair. He walked out of the office feeling the weight of every stare as he made his way past the employees he had once lorded over. Claire, the young teller, didn't even try to hide her smirk. He stepped through the glass doors, the same ones Jonathan Kingston had walked through just minutes before. The fresh air hit him, but it did nothing to cool the shame burning inside of him. For the first time in his life, Richard Calloway wasn't in control, and he had no one to blame but himself. Richard stepped onto the sidewalk outside Sterling National Bank, his mind in turmoil. His entire life had revolved around that job, that title. And now, he was one phone call away from losing everything. He pulled his car keys from his pocket with shaky hands and climbed into his sleek silver sedan. The moment he shut the door, the reality of the situation crashed down on him. He had humiliated himself. He had embarrassed the bank. And, worst of all, he had destroyed his own future. Damn it, he snarled, slamming his fists against the steering wheel. How had this happened? Because you judged him, a voice whispered in his head. You assumed. He tried to shove the thought away, but it clung to him like a shadow. He had seen Jonathan Kingston, a wealthy, confident black man, and immediately doubted his legitimacy. Despite the expensive suit, despite the poised demeanor, despite the black card that practically screamed elite status. And now, he was the one being cast aside. Richard exhaled, gripping the wheel. Maybe there was still time. Maybe if he called corporate, if he explained himself, they'd reconsider. He reached for his phone, only for it to vibrate in his hand. An incoming call. Corporate headquarters. His heart stopped. With a deep breath, he swiped to answer. "Hello." A pause, then, "Richard Calloway?" The voice was cool, unemotional. "Yes, sir," Richard said quickly. I wanted to speak with someone about the situation earlier. I think there's been a misunderstanding, and we're well aware of what happened," the voice cut in. "And after reviewing the incident, we've made our decision." Richard swallowed. "Sir, if I could just—" "You're terminated, effective immediately." The words hit him like a sledgehammer. His mouth fell open, but no sound came out. Terminated, not suspended, not written up, fired. The voice continued, completely unmoved. "We'll be forwarding your severance package details via email. You'll need to return any company-issued materials by end of business tomorrow. But thank you for your service. Goodbye." The line went dead. Richard stared at his phone, his world tilting beneath him. This was real. He was done. No more Sterling National. No more prestige. No more power. And all because he had judged the wrong man. His grip on the phone slackened, and for the first time in years, Richard Calloway felt completely and utterly powerless. Richard sat in his car, stunned, fired. The word kept replaying in his mind like a broken record. Just this morning, he had walked into Sterling National with authority, with confidence. He had felt untouchable. But now he was just another disgraced former employee. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. This couldn't be happening. He had given years of his life to that bank. He had climbed the ranks, proven himself. And now, one mistake, one moment of arrogance, and everything was gone. He took a shaky breath and pulled out his phone. He had connections, people who owed him favors. Maybe, just maybe, he could land on his feet. But as he opened his contacts list, another sinking realization hit him. Who would hire him after this? His termination wouldn't stay quiet for long. The banking world was small, and once word got out that he had cost Sterling National millions and lost business, his name would be blacklisted. His fingers hovered over the screen before slowly lowering. For the first time in a long time, Richard Calloway had no plan. A sharp knock on the driver's side window startled him. He turned, and his stomach dropped. Jonathan Kingston. Richard's throat went dry. Jonathan stood outside the car, his expression unreadable, his tailored suit pristine, despite the chaos he had just caused in Richard's life. Richard hesitated, but something in Jonathan's gaze told him ignoring him would only make things worse. With a resigned sigh, he rolled down the window. "Mr. Kingston," Richard said stiffly. Jonathan studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. "So, you lost your job." Richard's jaw tightened. He didn't respond. Jonathan exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "Tell me something, Calloway." His voice was calm but firm. "Was it worth it?" Richard's fingers clenched around the steering wheel. "Was what worth it?" he muttered. Jonathan tilted his head. "Judging me. Looking down on me. Assuming that because of my skin, I couldn't be a man of wealth, of success." He crossed his arms. "Was that worth throwing your entire career away?" Richard looked away. The answer was obvious. Jonathan sighed. "You know, I didn't come here to humiliate you any further," he said. "I came to offer you something most people wouldn't." Richard frowned. "And what's that?" Jonathan leaned in slightly. "A second chance." Richard stared at Jonathan, convinced he had misheard. "A second chance?" he repeated, disbelief lacing his voice. Jonathan nodded, his expression calm but serious. "That's right." Richard scoffed, shaking his head. "You just got me fired, humiliated me in front of my entire staff, and now you're telling me you want to help me?" Jonathan exhaled through his nose, unmoved by Richard's bitterness. "I didn't get you fired, Calloway. You did that to yourself." Richard flinched. "You assumed I was a fraud," Jonathan continued. "You treated me like a criminal, someone who didn't belong in your bank. And now, you know exactly what that feels like." Richard swallowed hard. The weight of his own hypocrisy was suffocating. "I could walk away right now," Jonathan went on, "and trust me, a part of me thinks I should. But the truth is," he let out a small sigh, "I believe people can change, if they're willing to." Richard's pride screamed at him to reject the offer, to tell Jonathan to go to hell and figure things out on his own. But another part of him, the part terrified of what came next, clung to the possibility. "What kind of second chance?" Richard asked hesitantly. Jonathan gave a small smirk. "I own multiple businesses, real estate, investments, finance firms. I have a position open in one of them." Richard's eyes widened. "You'd hire me?" Jonathan's smirk faded into a serious expression. "Not as a bank manager, not in a position of power. You'd be starting at the bottom, learning the industry from a different perspective. No shortcuts, no special treatment." Richard felt his stomach tighten. Starting over, from nothing. A demotion like that would be humiliating. He had spent years climbing to the top. Would he really throw away his pride and start at square one? But what choice did he have? No bank would touch him now. His reputation was in ruins. This wasn't just a second chance. It was his only chance. He exhaled slowly, looking down at his hands. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why would you do this?" Jonathan studied him for a long moment. "Because someone once gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve it," he said, "and I want to see if you're capable of becoming better than the man I met today." Richard's throat tightened. For the first time in years, someone wasn't judging him by his worst moment. They were offering him a way to fix it. The question was, would he take it? Richard sat in stunned silence, Jonathan Kingston's words hanging in the air like an unspoken challenge. A second chance, not a lifeline, not a shortcut back to power, a chance to start over, a chance to become better. Richard had always believed in status, in power, in climbing the ranks and keeping people like Jonathan Kingston beneath him. But now, for the first time in his life, he was the one at the bottom. And Jonathan, he was offering a hand up, not out of pity, not out of revenge, but because he believed Richard could change. Richard swallowed hard. His pride was screaming at him to walk away, to reject the offer and figure things out on his own. But deep down, he knew the truth. He wasn't going to get another opportunity like this. He wasn't going to be able to fix his life without accepting responsibility for what he had done. With a deep, shaky breath, he met Jonathan's eyes. "What do I have to do?" Jonathan studied him for a long moment. Then, with a small nod, he extended a hand. "You show up," he said. "You work, you listen, you learn." His expression darkened slightly. "And you prove to me, and to yourself, that you're not the man who stood behind that bank counter today." Richard hesitated, then slowly reached out and clasped Jonathan's hand. The grip was firm, steady. Jonathan held his gaze. "You don't get to treat this like a punishment," he said. "You either commit to becoming a better man, or you don't waste my time." Richard nodded, the weight of the moment settling in. For years he had been the man who judged others. Now, he had a chance to become the man who changed. As Jonathan let go and turned to leave, Richard sat back in his car, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He barely recognized himself. For the first time in his life, Richard Calloway wasn't the one looking down on others. He was the one learning to rise. The lesson: never judge someone by the color of their skin, their background, or your own assumptions. Respect should not be based on appearance, but on character. The way you treat people, especially when you think they have nothing to offer you, reveals who you truly are. Because one day, the same door you refuse to open for others might be the one you desperately need to walk through yourself. The world has a way of humbling those who think they are above others, and karma has no patience for arrogance. The person you look down on today may be the very one who holds your fate in their hands tomorrow. Choose wisely how you treat people, because respect and fairness will always take you further than prejudice and pride ever could. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notification to be the first to know when interesting and lesson-packed stories like this one drop. Peace.